right, here we go with the next chapter in Brian's winter. When we left off, he had managed to kill a moose. Oh, my kitty is here. Hello, Marley. Anyway, he had just killed that moose and he cut her all up, skinned her, was bringing her all home. Now, the last time he stored a bunch of meat in his home, that proved to be troublesome because the bear came. So I'm wondering how he's going to figure out how to store this so the bear doesn't come again. Let's see. The cow proved to be a godsend. The next day, Brian awakened in mid-afternoon, starving and not sure it had all happened, although his body felt as if he'd been sleeping in a cement mixer. Every bone and muscle seemed to ache, but the moose was all there, leaning against the side of the shelter. He was starving and made a fire outside. He used the hatchet to chop out a section of ribs and cooked them on a stick over the flames and ate them when the fat was crackling. "All I need is some barbecue sauce," he said aloud, grease dripping down his chin, "and a Coke." When he had first come out of the shelter, it had been partly cloudy, with the sun shining through gray wisps of clouds. But while he ate, the clouds became thicker until there was no blue, and he felt a few drops hit his cheek. Not again, not rain. But it was. It didn't pour at first, and he took the rest of the day to get in firewood. He had found a stand of dead poplar, all dry and easy to burn, but still about a half a mile away, and he dragged wood until it was dark, and the rain was steady, miserable, cold downpour. He made a fire inside the shelter and coals from the outside fire, and soon it was warm and toasty. He hung the rabbit-skin shirt up to dry and lay back to wait the rain out. Having worked all night the previous night and slept most of the day, he wasn't sleepy and thought that the rain seemed light and would probably end by daylight, and when he finally dozed off, warm and snug in the shelter, it seemed to be coming down more lightly all the time. But at daylight it hadn't stopped. He looked out at the drizzle. It had melted all of the snow off and everything was a mess. And now it had become cold and the rain was freezing into ice on the limbs and grass. And he was glad that he had plenty of wood pulled up and a dry place to live. It rained for a solid 8 days, cold and wet. And if he hadn't had the shelter and meat, he would have gone crazy. And in a strange way, it never really did stop raining. Each day it got colder and colder, and the rain kept coming down, and Brian could hear limbs breaking off with the weight of the ice on them. And just when he thought he could stand it no longer, the rain turned to snow. Only this time not a soft snow. A wind came out of the northwest that howled through the trees like something insane, actually awakened him in the middle of the night and made him sit bolt upright in fear. The snow was small and hard at first, driven needles that seemed to cut his cheek when he looked outside, and then changing to blown finer snow that found ways to seep into the shelter and melt hissing on the fire. He was not idle. He had dragged in enough wood to last if he was careful, but by the second and third day he was going stir crazy and was looking for things to do. Luckily, there was much that needed doing. His clothing was far from adequate. The rabbit-skin shirt was like paper and ripped easily. Indeed, had been torn in several places during the moose attack and needed restitching. And Brian, with great effort, stretched the moose hide out in the rain and cut it in half and brought the rear half into the shelter. The hide was still wet from being on the moose, hadn't had time to dry. But the fire and heat in the shelter worked fast, and within a few days it had dried sufficiently to work. It was stiff and thick, and while it was still damp, he cut a rectangle for a moose shirt, stitching it down the sides with moose hide laces, making it larger than the rabbit-skin shirt. He did the same kind of sleeves and then made a crude hood, which he stitched around the head opening. He did all this with the hair side in, and when he put the rabbit-skin shirt on underneath and then a moose-hide parka on the outside, even with the moose-hide still uncured, he could feel his body warming up instantly. He also nearly went down with the weight. He figured the coat weighed at least 30 pounds, maybe more, and decided he wouldn't do much running in it. The snowstorm lasted 3 days on top of the rain, and Brian worked on his weak spot, his hands. He used moose hide and made a pair of crude mittens by using his hands for a pattern and a piece of charcoal to draw on the hide. The thumbs were so large he could almost stick his whole hand in the thumb hole. These he made with the hair side in, and fashioned them large enough to allow a second set of rabbit-skin mitts to be worn inside. The mittens were so big they kept falling off his hands, and he used moose hide to make a cord that went over his shoulders and held the mittens up if he relaxed his hands. This was all hard work and kept him busy for days, but worse work was the hide. As it dried, it started to harden and turned into something very close to a board. He worked it back and forth over a rounded piece of wood as he'd done with the lacing, and this process, trying to soften the dried moose hide, took longer than sewing up the clothing, and in the end he had to settle for less than he wanted. He had the hide loose where it counted, in the armpits and elbows and the hood, but much of the rest of it was only half supple, stiff enough so that he felt as if he were wearing a coat of armor, and still stiff though he worked on it for hours when at last the storm ended. Brian expected to be snowed in, but in fact it was only 8 or 9 inches deep. It had been a fine driven snow and hadn't accumulated to any depth, but it was blasted into everything. Many of the trees had a full 6 inches sticking out to the side of the tree, where the snow had been driven by the wind. It was still beautiful in the sunlight, but had a different look from the last fluffy snow, and it was a deeper cold than before. Brian couldn't estimate temperature, but he thought it must be near 0, but quiet. The wind had stopped completely, and his clothes kept him warm as if he'd been in the shelter. He started to brush the snow off the stacked moose meat, and then thought better of it. The meat was frozen and protected under the snow from ice, from the rain, and safer there than in the open. He didn't think the bear would come. It must be hibernating by now. And the same for Betty, whom he hadn't seen since just after the bear attack. So the meat should be all right just beneath the snow. He needed wood, and he spent most of that day dragging in dead poplar, finally taking the parka off because it was so heavy, and working in the rabbit-skin shirt alone. Everything had ice frozen on it, but it chipped off easily with the hatchet. When he had a good stack, enough for another week, he was definitely gun-shy now about storms, he chopped some meat off one of the back legs of the moose for stew and settled in for another night of rubbing the hide of his parka to soften it. And he wondered that night, the night of day 94, if this was it. Was this all winter would be, eating meat and rubbing hide and waiting for the next rain to turn to snow? Chapter 12. It did not rain again, nor did the snow go away. The temperature stayed down, and in 4 days it snowed lightly, maybe an inch, and then in 4 more days another inch or two, and then in 4 more days, regular as clockwork, winter came. The snow never came deeply, never another wild blizzard, just an inch or two every 4 days. But the snow didn't leave between times, didn't melt, and before long there was a foot on the ground, a foot of dry powder. At first it was all very settled and comfortable. Brian's clothing seemed to work. He had plenty of meat, plenty of firewood, although he had to go some distance to get it. He knew how much wood it would take for a given time and brought in enough for a week. It took a full day. And then he had nothing to do the rest of the week except work his moose hide clothing against the wooden peg to soften it and eat moose meat stew. Summer had been so active, and now he had suddenly come to a virtual stop. He couldn't fish anymore because the ice was too thick to chop through with the hatchet. He didn't need to hunt because he figured roughly 400 pounds of moose left to eat. Lying by the fire one evening softening hide, he did some rough math, and if he ate 4 pounds of moose meat a day, he would make at least 100 days before needing more meat. More than 3 months. Let's see, he thought. It was late November now. No, early December. No, wait. He counted the days on his marks and decided it was the last week in November. Thanksgiving. He'd forgotten Thanksgiving. He could do that. Have a Thanksgiving meal. The date was a little off. He would be late, but it felt good to think of it, and he prepared for it as if he were home. He would eat moose, of course, but he had found that the hump meat was the best, and he chopped a 3-pound piece off the frozen block by his door. He would need more, some kind of sauce. Then he remembered the berries. On one of his wood-gathering runs, he'd gone past the north end of the lake, and there had been a string of small, scraggly trees loaded with bright red berries. Because everything was under a foot of snow, he hadn't seen a berry since summer. These berries, looking fresh and bright even though they were frozen solid, struck him as very odd. They looked delicious and hung in small clumps, and he smelled them, then took a handful and popped them in his mouth. At first he couldn't taste them because they were frozen, but as soon as they thawed, he got the flavor. They were tangy and had a mild bitter taste that made him want to pucker. Also, they had large pits. They were similar to the gut cherries he'd had trouble with during the summer, except that they didn't make him sick, and the sour taste reminded him of something else he couldn't at first place, and later remembered as vinegar or a sour sauce flavor. They would make a good sauce for a Thanksgiving meal, and he went along the lakeshore and picked one of the smaller aluminum pans full, and it was in this way that he learned about snowshoes. It did not come that fast. There was about a foot of snow, powder but with a stiffness, and as he walked along the lake in his deer-hide boots, he startled a rabbit from beneath an evergreen, and it took off like a shot, all changed to white, across the snow, without sinking in. Brian watched it run away, and had taken another 4 or 5 steps when it hit him that the rabbit was running on top of the snow, while Brian was sinking in with each step. He moved to the rabbit's tracks and studied them. They were huge, fully twice the size of the feet he had seen on the rabbits earlier, And when he examined the tracks more closely, he saw that the rabbit had grown hair to increase the size of its feet, and he thought how perfect they were to be able to do that, change color in the winter and grow bigger feet to stay on top of the snow. How perfect. And he set the information back in his mind and went on about preparing for Thanksgiving. He packed Snow in with the berries and put them on the fire to melt and boil. Then he put the hump meat in the large pan with Snow and set that on to boil as well. So much, he thought, for cooking Thanksgiving dinner. What he wanted was a table and a chair and a tablecloth. No, he thought. What he wanted was a turkey and all the trimmings, and then a table and chairs and a tablecloth, and his mother and father sitting with him, and milk. Oh, yes, a glass of cold milk, and bread and butter and potatoes and gravy, and what he wanted more than anything was out. To be back in the world, to have all that stuff and be back in the world, and then to go to a movie. No, to sit and watch television with your belly packed, and watch a football game and belch, and that was what he wanted. What he did instead was clean his shelter. He had been sleeping on the foam pad that had come with the survival pack, and he straightened everything up and hung his bag out in the sun to air dry, and then used the hatchet to cut the ends of the new evergreen boughs and laid them like a carpet in the shelter. As soon as he brought the boughs inside and the heat from the fire warmed them, they gave off the most wonderful smell, filled the whole shelter with the odor of spring, and he brought the bag back inside and spread the pad and bag and felt as if he were in a new home. The berries boiled first, and he added snow water to them and kept them boiling until he had a kind of mush in the pan. By that time the meat had cooked, and he set it off to the side and tasted the berry mush. Bitter, he thought, but tangy and not all that bad. And he cut a piece of the moose hump off, a thin slice, and dipped it in the sauce and ate it in 2 bites. It was delicious, almost like having steak sauce or a kind of a bitter ketchup. He took another cut of meat, dipped it, ate it as well, the juice dripping down his chin, and was on the third one when he realized that this was his Thanksgiving dinner. And I'm eating like a wolf, he thought, before I give thanks. It stopped him, the idea of giving thanks. At first his mind just stopped, and he thought, for what? For the plane crash? For being here? I should thank somebody for that? Then a small voice, almost a whisper, came into his mind, and all it said was, it could have been worse. You could have been down in the plane with the pilot. And he felt awful for his attitude, turned away from the food, and forced himself to be grateful for all the good luck he'd had, and to not think about the bad at all. Just that, escaping from the plane alive, that was luck. And to be able to live and learn and know things, to be able to hunt, to be thankful for the animals' lives that had been spent to keep him fed, to be thankful for the deer and the moose, Lord, the moose, like getting a whole food store, and to be thankful for his shelter and knife and the hatchet. The key to it all, nothing without the hatchet. Just that would take all his thanks. And every stick, every twig of wood that burned to keep him warm, and his sleeping bag, and Betty, saving him from the bear, and the chickadees that hung around the camp, and the sun that brought each new day. All that, he thought, all that and more to be thankful for. And he ended the prayer, as it had seemed to become, with another thought about the pilot down in the lake. How he hoped the pilot had had a good life, and was where it was good for him now. Then he ate quietly, thinking of his mother and father, and when he finished his Thanksgiving it was dark, pitch dark, and he crawled into his bag to sleep, and had just closed his eyes and started to get drowsy when he heard the gunshot. Whoa! That just took me by surprise. Anybody have any predictions about hearing a gunshot? That has to mean there's another human out there. What's going to happen next, guys?